Welcome to today's panel, everyone. The panel's title, How COVID Accelerated the Need for RPA. I am Robert Love. I'm a consultant at UiPath, and I will be moderating today's panel. Joining me today, we have Tyler Krimmel, an instructor at Georgia Brown College, Kevin Quinn, a partner at Financial Services Advisory at PwC. In today's panel, with these experts, we will discuss how COVID has severely weakened or decimated several industries, heightening the need for automation in order to help businesses maintain efficiency, but also reduce costs. So, with that, let's get started. I've prepared some questions for each of our panelists, and at the end of this session, we'll take a few minutes to answer some audience-collected questions. All right. My first question is actually for Tyler. Prior to COVID, what would you say was the trajectory of RPA?
So I think that's a good question. To start out with, I think, what we saw was that RPA, pre-COVID, I'll say, was something that was obviously building in demand. There was a lot of interest in it, but I will say that pre-RPA, it almost felt like a bit of a trend. And to me, it was kind of like what we saw 10, 15 years ago. It was almost like the early adoption of agile practices in a sense. It was being promoted, work was kind of being done. We saw proof of concepts being created. But I think that the rationale behind why people were building bots was because almost everybody else was doing it. And because of that, we probably should too. I think what's happened through RPA, certainly over the past couple of years, but certainly through COVID, is that RPA has been able to very quickly demonstrate quick wins. And I think it's making a lot of organizations' leadership to reconsider how they create, how they perceive the value proposition that they provide to their clients and customers. It allows them to kind of reposition the business models and processes that they're able to execute on. And it allows them to look at capabilities just a little bit differently from how they would have looked at kind of before RPA solutions existed. So I think that that's what I'm seeing from across a number of sectors. I see that in finance. I certainly see that in government. I see that in consulting. I see it where I am within education and academic institutions. And certainly I see it potentially rising within healthcare as well. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities that do exist with this.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, Tyler. We actually have our other panelists. Apologies for the technical difficulties. Let me introduce Phil first, who's a CEO and Chief Analyst at HFS Research. And Phil, I did have a question for you. Tyler just told us about what he thought the trajectory of RPA was looking like prior to COVID. What I'm curious is, during this time period, how have you seen RPA implemented in companies during this pandemic? Did it help cut costs? What were the outcomes that you've been seeing?
That's a great question. There was a lot of trajectory behind RPA before COVID, but it wasn't all the right trajectory, if you know what I mean. So there was a lot of talk, maybe not as much activity beyond sort of piecemeal projects that we'd have liked to have seen. And so what COVID did was it caused everyone to pause, think about what they were doing, and try and figure out a broader strategy. And I think what's happened, really, it took a few weeks after COVID before bigger decisions were being made, often higher up the food chain within enterprises, to make a bigger pivot, more rapid pivot towards digital. And automation is seen as a native competency that's going to get you there. So I think there's been a big dynamic shift within how companies are perceiving automation and the role it plays within driving a digital organization. So I think what we're seeing is a little bit of a step back from some businesses, a look at what they'd achieved before COVID versus where they are now, and figuring out where they want to move forward. So with a lot of companies, they've actually bought a lot of licenses. They'd already made quite a lot of investments, but hadn't moved as fast as they would have liked. And now there's a sudden emphasis to accelerate, to do things faster, to cut some corners, to cut through red tape, to cut through bureaucracy, and often do this in a digital environment. So I think one of the things that all enterprises have had to do is figure out how do we get things done in an environment where it's much more virtual. We're having to do a lot more kind of whiteboarding, virtual sessions than we had in the past, and just getting used to making decisions, doing things using Microsoft Teams, for example. And once they got used to that, we're starting to see a lot more acceleration, a lot more fast decision making with businesses who know what they're doing. But I would add here that there's two types of businesses in this space right now. Those who I think have figured out their baseline, they figured out their plan to survive this, and they've fundamentally found the North Star they're heading towards. Those companies, they know what they're doing at this point. They know what investments they need to make. And it's a fairly smooth journey to get where they're going. There's a lot of businesses who are still, I think, uncertain of their direction. They're still trying to figure out what's going on. They're worried that they can't shift all their products and services into a digital setting and haven't quite figured it out yet. And those are businesses, I think, who haven't quite got a smooth journey in play. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. Some businesses are moving fast. They know what they're doing. They know where they went wrong. They know what to put right. Others, I think, are still trying to figure this one out. So a bit of a mixed bag. Decision-making has moved higher up the food chain. Automation is a necessary capability, a native capability that companies need if they're gonna make it through this. But I think the way they're approaching it is definitely moving into a broader strategic initiative and less from sort of smaller tactical projects and smaller task-operated things.
Oh, thank you for that. That's insightful. Speaking of the challenges that some of these enterprises or companies encounter, Kevin, can you speak to how a smaller company that's looking to implement RPA during this time would go about it? Will it even be impactful for them?
Sure. So I think as you look at the RPA topic, a lot of the investment, and I'd argue probably the licensing model from a lot of the software vendors and the business model was targeted at larger enterprises initially. We can argue some of the challenges that have been had with kind of big RPA implementations over the past couple of years, and Phil noted some of those, but just even getting into how to deal with managing risk and control in a large enterprise environment, how to deal with kind of push and pull between more underlying strategic IT decisions. Like these are things that just from a velocity perspective tend to slow the implementation of the technology and or make big firms question it. I think if you start looking at smaller enterprises, that problem is probably less of a inhibitor. You have the advantage that most small organizations, one, have a footprint where they're probably more reliant on packaged software versus custom built software, where they have less control over customization. They have also probably less religion around who actually takes on development. So the concept of kind of business users taking a larger role in development is maybe not as controversial or political. And so, and then the flexibility to think a little bit more pragmatically around a control framework that's fit for purpose. So I think from that sense, I'd actually argue in the current environment, small organizations are probably better set up to move quicker with this technology. And, I think, that we've seen, at least working with our clients, I would say from a profiling perspective, we've probably seen more success at getting to scale quicker with RPA in that kind of profile of organization. I think the counter to that is, I think there is still, to the points made before, I think there's still work that has to be done in the software space to make sure, the pricing makes sense, the training makes sense, the messaging, like everything else around that makes sense. But I would think that is one of the bigger targets that's coming into play right now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, anything to add on that, Tyler, Phil? Just wanted to see if you had any additional thoughts on how the smaller companies might operate. All right. Looking more at, let's move on to the future, right? And Phil, I'm actually going to bounce right back to you. In your opinion, if we look going forward, will RPA permanently replace the jobs that we're seeing lost right now during the pandemic?
No, I don't think so. Not directly anyway. I think where we're seeing RPA have some impact on direct job replacement has been when certain tasks are already outsourced by a business and they can actually start to deploy RPA to reduce the amount of work that needs to be manually delivered back to them. So it's impacted more workers within the outsourcing providers themselves, but the outsourcing providers are doing quite well at growing their businesses in certain areas in this market as well, because companies are looking at outsourcing to combat volatile environments. So I wouldn't say it's been a job replacement at all. It's been more of an augmentation of people. And we've seen this a lot within many scenarios where it's actually improving the quality of people's jobs. It's improving the careers that people are venturing into. I would say that before COVID, the watchword for a lot of this was resistance to change. A lot of companies would actually take on a little bit of this, but then resist change because it did impact things. But a lot of executives are now trying to become proponents of change. They're trying to advocate doing things differently, moving into digital environments more aggressively. And RPA is a tool of many in a box of integrated automation capability that helps you get there. And it's one tool of several that can really help efficiency, productivity, and workarounds and digital transformation. So, I've seen some clients look at RPA as a direct job replacement tool, and I quite honestly would say that has not been very successful. In my experience, that's not the right way to go about it. You're not going to achieve a lot of success unless you've got extremely high throughput, repetitive tasks. So I think that thinking is kind of fading away a bit now, and it's much more, how do we pivot? How do we flip? How do we create a digital environment where you get up in the morning and you plug into UiPath or IBM or whoever you're working for? That's your experience. And I just think there's a bigger set of thinking at play than these kind of job replacement things we were talking about in the past.
Yeah, maybe I could jump in real quick. Just some additional thoughts. I think one of the definite themes we've seen a shift from kind of pre-COVID to kind of the current new normal. 2-3 years ago, every RPA discussion we'd have with the client would essentially be about cost takeout, and it would be basically be a simple question: how many bots can I build? How many roles can I replace? I think the returns on those that type of business case and that type of strategy tended to be lackluster. I think partially because RPA in itself wasn't going to eliminate jobs without significant rethinking of kind of the underlying organizational operating models. And two, just most organizations from a change management perspective weren't ready for that. Kind of, it's not really a technology question. I think it was more an organizational question. I think the interesting thing from client discussions we've had over and work we're doing over the past several months, while the cost of running an operation is certainly still always going to be top of agenda, the questions around automation have definitely shifted to resiliency and to experience both employee experience and customer experience as the primary drivers, and trying to think through, like, how do I run a remote workforce that's distributed all over the world and is not located in central offices where I don't have core teams together? How can I actually make sure work is getting done correctly? And automation is a tool that helps achieve that. And I think that's making a lot of our clients rethink a bit of the value proposition behind this. And while cost is a second order factor ultimately in this, because you need to be able to get the same or increase volumes of work done for the same cost, it's not sort of the first way it's being measured. And I think that's maybe the biggest mind shift we've seen recently.
Okay. Thank you. If we look at one of the industries that has some of the most pressing challenges, Tyler, this question is for you. How can healthcare use RPA technology today? And even more specifically, can RPA be used to help combat the virus?
So I think that's an interesting question. I think what's important to understand and what we're learning about the virus is how it's impacted, obviously, healthcare as an industry, but I think more importantly, how it's impacted health and well-being that exists across kind of the human value chain of service delivery across all industries. Maybe a way to think a little bit differently about that question, or at least the first part of the question, is how can RPA kind of improve health and well-being? And I think the health industry is part of that, but I think that there's more to it. So I'll let's kind of flip that around. Can RPA be used to combat the virus? I think, yes and no. There are, it can, not directly. It's not like, it's not a cure. It's not light inside the body. It's a joke. But if we start by kind of, if we start looking across sectors and kind of how work is generally done, if we look at process work, if we look at technology work, the way that companies and organizations are operating kind of pre-COVID, there was significant dependency kind of on staff, on the use of vendors, on offshoring work, and dependency on kind of heavy technology teams. This is something that Kevin was kind of alluding to, around, the enhancement of solutions, leading large projects, initiation through to delivery, execution of work. I think in COVID, what we've kind of learned is that numerous organizations, I look at financial institutions, government, health, education, we saw a lot of these workflows for development of services and products disrupted. And I think, as I said, when I think of healthcare itself, it's part of the larger ecosystem. It kind of starts, as I see it, with where I am within education, which kind of feeds recruitment through to service delivery, and through to just kind of wellness in life. What we see today, comfort, dignity, need to support just people generally as they go through what is a really disruptive time in our history. The way that I've seen RPA and the way that I've been able to speak with a lot of the industry partners who we actively work with around the impacts of this virus kind of is, as I said, that more complete human value chain. So if I think about how the impact of this technology can support us, it starts with some of the projects that I'll say we're even doing within the college right now, beginning to leverage robotics process automation. So, if we think about health resource support, the need to onboard individuals, a lot of that process actually starts with what happens within the college system, the university system. One of the issues, actually, one of the projects that we're literally starting, we're kicking it off this week, is around how we're supporting our students through their processes of co-op and work integrated learning. They require permits, co-op work permits, to be able to be issued, to be able to go out and do much of this job. So obviously, COVID has disrupted critically the process that exists within the college system with where I am. And so one of the challenges, or some of the challenges that we're looking at, is how do we begin to manage a lot of the manual data entry, the errors that go out on a lot of these letters, and the disruption that happens when we have hundreds of students getting ready to go to co-op within health organizations, health institutions, working with health technology companies who now aren't able to go. We have potentially up to 10 to 15% of students who regularly have incorrect processing of these letters due to human error. So we see RPA as a potential solution to address this. As we transition more to the actual use cases within healthcare, obviously we've seen over the last couple of years with Canada numerous proof of concepts for automation to be able to kind of execute along the medical care value chain, onboarding, registration, patient booking, referrals processing. But where I see a lot of potential value in RPA as well to support this would be in some of the health information management. And to kind of your first question, can this better support and help to address issues with COVID? Can this fight? Well, it takes information to fight. So where does that information come from? I look at disciplines like health information management. So some of their processes include, coding practices, kind of allocating conditions and procedures as the interventions necessary to support patients. A lot of this processing remains manually done. And there's kind of that need to be able to transcribe into actual systems. Some EMR systems are now doing this, but again, there's a need for modification. There's a need for audit. And for hospitals and large institutions, if they continue to work with these vendors to manage incremental changes, those costs are likely significantly higher than the cost of RPA solutions are. We look at other processes. Privacy release of information is a good example of this. Entire workflows in which we need to be able to transact patient information, request for consent of information. We need to ensure that we're following standards, legislation, and that there's a need for information distribution, whether that goes through to insurance, physicians, legal divisions. And then obviously the piece that's going to add more value is data analytics and research, how we standardize the data capture from various types of services. So, what happens is, at least within Canada, each of the different key services are generally managed within their own databases and their own kind of hubs due to funding. So if there's, patients who enter care clinics, day surgery versus tracking clients who go through emergency, inpatients, those patients who are in a hospital for greater than 24 hours, and then medical clinics. All of this data needs to be leveraged and validated, based on the research that's being conducted to address critical needs, whether those needs are to address issues with cancer, whether it's COVID, whatever the case may be. I think a big part of where I see the evolution of this discipline going is to see where health information management and health informatics begins to see a convergence with automation. And so I see kind of evolutionary roles, kind of health automation informatician as being something that could eventually exist. And so that's kind of where I see how automation is supporting this. As a brief summary, and certainly beyond health, I see it kind of expanding to numerous industries as well. I see what's happened recently within banking, specific COVID initiatives to support changes to tax and the workflows and processes necessary to support organizations and the banks themselves in being able to update and build those workflows, and even something for people going back to kind of wellness, right? Changes to mortgage rules, being able to allow mortgage deferrals that are taking place within Canada. This is a significant process. And so what we've seen within financial institutions is that, front-end agents would be able to make a change in one application. Bots would be able to kind of push down those changes in other subsequent back-end applications. And what this is going to do is allow the call agent to really respond better to the needs of that client customer. So again, a lot of really significant value to support the value chain that's being disrupted as a result of.
I keyed in on that, and I want to take that value chain concept you started. You touched on a few different things that I thought were really critical there, right? The future of work, even encompassing, everything all the way back through the education component, as well as the different trends that are coming into play with data and informatics and analytics as well. Kevin, you talked a little bit about the employee experience earlier. Is there anything else you can add about what the future of work might look like when you look at things at a really macroscopic level?
Sure. So, I think one of the interesting trends with the emergence of RPA has been the target market from the perspective of the software vendors historically has been not IT. And this has been marketed as a technology that users, and by users meaning kind of people that sit in, in client-facing functions, sit in corporate functions like at finance, risk, compliance, et cetera, would have the ability to build technology. Now, there is still questions around how that actually, that type of function would operate within an organization, but I think clearly we've seen a shift amongst our clients, and particularly within bigger kind of corporate functions like finance, towards thinking through, is this the start of a somewhat of a revolution in how we think about the types of skills that users should be building for their future jobs and their future career path. And so, like a simple example from finance function would be, how the person whose primary job is to perform reconciliations, and it tends to be more of a transaction-oriented job. As that work becomes more automated, can you build enough skills where, as their role turns to more research and insights into, for example, where things go wrong or how to prevent reconciliation issues from happening in the first place, can they build the skills, right? So you're kind of creating the role of kind of a digital controller type thing. It's not from messages I think everyone said, it's not that RPA by itself is going to do that, but I think RPA ends up being a good kind of entry point into that ecosystem of lower code, more self-service driven technologies. And so we've seen a big kind of push to make make some of the platforms in the RPA space kind of the initial showcase for that in a lot of work. What that is generating is, I think, a lot of our clients is an interesting conversation to think about. Okay, what is my workforce strategy of the future? How do I define those roles? How do I build training plans, to make sure people are actually building the skills while still performing their existing jobs? How do we think about what, to my point before about the organization models haven't kept up with automation being implemented, how do I start to form how organization models will operate? And then how do I actually equip users with the infrastructure, the environment, the controls, collaboration, the oversight from IT, with everything else in order to make this functional. So it's, I think this is definitely exciting times. I think that's probably one of the most interesting threads that's been generated out of the rise of RPA.
Yeah, it is exciting. It is exciting for sure, and definitely on the upward trend as you have all articulated. Phil, maybe you can speak to whether or not the companies that have started scaling RPA, or just any companies for that matter, if we're going to see a scale down at all once the pandemic is over and social distancing is no longer required.
I certainly think we're going to see a scale down because, we did a research of 900 organizations leading into this, and only 13% of RPA users had actually achieved any type of scale. So we're going to be scaling up on this stuff for another 2 or 3 years before companies get to a point where the question will be, do we need to keep using RPA, or can we start to turn some of this into an all API environment? So this is more of a continuation of and an evolution of technology to automate business process, the way companies need to get things done with. And scale is all about rapidity, speed to digital, moving on a pivot that some companies never foresaw right now. And the last thing companies are thinking about is scaling down. They're thinking about how do we become more nimble, flexible, and agile in this type of model? How do we get our customers and our employees who are living in the same dual digital environment today operating? Another piece of data I'll share with you is 37% of businesses, we spoke to 600 of them just a month ago in the Global 2000, only 37% are going to revert back to the same type of work model they were in before. They're not going back to the full-time office environment. They're staying in a much more virtual model now. If there was one industry I don't want to be in right now, it's corporate real estate. It's getting decimated. Companies are looking to say, hey, we're just going to go virtual. Hey, maybe in a year's time, or we'll go back to being in a corporate office. But those days are over. We're virtualizing. This is the new model. RPA has a very important role to play in helping underpin an automation strategy that has to be native to get there. Business executives need to get savvy quickly about how to leverage these technologies, when to leverage them, what are they capable of, how can they help workarounds, how can they help breathe life into existing systems, how can they help drive processes to digital, that if you can't do it, you're out of the game here. So I think it's just a very broader, more strategic set of thinking going on right now. And no one's thinking about scaling down. They're thinking about how do we get much more fluid, much more digital with things, because once you go digital, everything is faster, everything is cheaper, your products are cheaper, you're more competitive, you interact much more effectively with the environment around you. So this is a permanent change to something very different, where I don't even think we will be talking about scale in 3 or 4 years. We would have scaled. We would have the type of hypercloud environment that's going to get us there. We're going to have the automation that's native to everything we do, that we probably won't even talk about automation anymore. These are the types of things that are happening, and I think we have to think about, we're not going back anywhere. We're just going in one direction.
So no, I appreciate that. So Tyler, if, based on what Phil says, it sounds like the use of robotics and bots is going to continue to go on up. The follow-on question I have for you is how is it that it will help workers today, of course, and not replace them?
So yeah, and I think, like what's been said, it's not about the fact that it's going to necessarily just replace workers. There may be some displacement for lower value add activities. I think what will generally happen, though, and to the point that was made, is that you're going to see kind of a disruption and a significant change in basically the value proposition, as I said before, that companies are going to be able to make. It allows them to reconsider again. As I said, I think I spoke to the idea of a business model, allows them to reevaluate the capabilities that they're able to deliver. It allows them to evaluate the scale at which they're able to deliver value. One of the companies that we've worked very closely with, and actually an interesting industry that we've worked closely with, is another one that's kind of an emergent tech area. But the company that we've worked with actually is in the domain of cybersecurity. We've worked closely with it's a Toronto-based firm. They're kind of in the space of threat intelligence, dark web threat analytics, incident response, forensics work. And, one of the solutions that they kind of stood up was, a comprehensive security operations center as a service. They kind of took what they had built. They started to evaluate the potential of looking to augment and to increase their capability to deliver their services. And this is something that over the past 6 months, they have really grown quite significantly in terms of their client base without needing to significantly onboard additional staff or resources. But they've been able to significantly increase the value proposition and the use of their staff and their resources to be able to do more of the critical analysis work, specifically dealing with specific types of threats, doing analytics, and conducting forensic, this sort of work that basic automation processes can't replicate. But for their principal work, just as an example, or as almost a case study, the triage work that they kind of do whenever there's an incident or a security incident that exists, the assessment, the monitoring, the data collection, and then the triage, the action on it. This is work that using robotics, they've been able to reduce resource on that aspect of their work by 80% and investing and also reducing the time to support their customers by 85%. I think what that does is that allows them to create higher value add work for their employees. It also allows them to address more critical issues that are taking place within their clients and the clients that they're working to service. When it comes to how this is shifting ultimately and how is this going to help workers? Well, I think, like I said, in that example, we're seeing how companies are able to kind of evaluating what they do, how they service, the value they provide. I think a key question that robotics, at least in the short term, is asking or is allowing companies, leaders, product managers to be able to answer is, do we need kind of heavy technology, heavy solution? Do we need to add to our architecture? Or can we build, small bridges that meet our needs while working to determine a more maximum viable solution? So it's almost like a stopgap of a minimum viable solution option analysis tool that allows us to determine where critical investment needs to go. I think when I see employees, again, I don't see there being a reduction to headcount as much in this space, as much as I see there being a need for more employees with more convergent skills. The discipline that I kind of was born from, and in which a lot of our students that go through our program continue to evolve from, is kind of the disciplines like business analysis, business and data analytics. If you add to that now robotics process automation, and if you add to that further more specific domain sectors, cybersecurity, health informatics, suddenly you have a resource that is able to kind of do and add significantly more value. One of the trends that certainly we're seeing when it comes to organizations is this idea of citizen development models taking place. The idea and the emphasis that, business users can actually learn to develop and help to manage some of the automations, going back to kind of what Kevin was speaking to, the idea that there's a closer bond between RPA and kind of end business users as opposed to heavy technology teams. So I think for me, there's a lot of value in this. I know where we are at the college and certainly working with a number of different organizations in and across the city of Toronto, we're seeing how by teaching RPA type technologies, this is allowing individuals who are having, possibly difficult times in being able to find traditional types of work. One of the groups that I actively work with are internationally educated professionals. And, we're working now to actually secure funding so that we have an RPA program for individuals who have recently come to Canada, so that there's an opportunity with kind of an 8-week program pathway to actually leverage the technology to build on their existing skills, their education, but now become more competitive and add more value to this environment and to organizations looking to adopt this technology. So I see there being a lot of potential opportunity in terms of workforce, and certainly for organizations, they're not going to be disrupting and taking away jobs as much as they're going to be looking to redeploy those jobs to add more value, certainly from a customer-centric perspective and kind of a higher level analysis perspective as well.
Okay. I think now is a good time for us to actually answer some of the questions that were collected prior to the panel from the audience. So the first question comes from Twitter. Anaj asks, and Bill, I'd love for you to answer this question. It seems like we'll be living with COVID for a while. Do you think increased automation or RPA will be required for businesses to run safely?
That's a very good question. And yes, it will be required, and it already has been required. I was personally involved in some work that was done in the British National Health Service, and it was amazing to see how you could take a lot of documents that had been passing critical patient information between doctors' surgeries, clinical outposts, and things with hospitals, etc., and really putting that data together into an electronic format so you can then manage this more effectively. We've seen some of the issues with track and trace apps, and they've been successful in different countries for different reasons, but ultimately you're dealing with a lot of legacy technology, a lot of the need for screen scrapes, macros, just to get basic data moved around the systems. Another issue we're seeing is broken supply chains all over the place. You know, things are getting goods in and out of services and markets and geographies is really challenging. It's changing all the time, lockdowns, re-lockdowns, all sorts of things happening. And it's a technology that is starting to be used in areas like supply chain, front office, and not just lower risk back office areas. So I definitely see it as actually a very important technology for COVID because it does require a quick fix. It is a band-aid in many cases, and that's not a bad thing. You know, if you need to patch data, scrape screen from some green screen mainframe and move it into another system to get information that's critical for tracking, tracing, documents, passing information to medical professionals, things like that. It's just has so many uses for more immediate needs. If anything, it's a more critical tech for the short term than it might even be for the long term. And I'm seeing it deployed in many, many different places at this point in time. And it's a very useful technology that's going to be with us for a long time.
Let me ask this next question to Kevin, and actually Tyler, you and feel free to chime in as well. Kevin, one of the audience members, Kelly, asked, what are the top 5 things organizations should consider before implementing RPA in their organization today?
Sure. So, yeah, I think the things that would come to top of mind, one would be kind of your overall people strategy, both how are you actually going to engage your workforce with the use of the technology, and how are you going to make sure you have the talent to actually build this technology? Governance and risk, how are you going to make sure the technology actually functions over the long term? You can deal with change management, you can deal with some of the technical brittleness issues and some of the production support challenges, and just making sure, you know, from an overall structural perspective, this is improving your environment, not making it more complicated. Process intelligence, how do you actually discover what it is that you do as an organization? One of the biggest eye-opening experiences anytime we do an RPA engagement with a client is how we realize that just even a basic kind of well understood function, the transparency that sits behind what people actually do in the trenches day to day for that function isn't as well known or is inconsistent across multiple people performing the same function. Figuring out from a benefits case perspective, what outcomes are you actually going after? You know, from the previous point I made around cost, it's not all about cost takeout, and that's a really important thing. You have to think about what you're actually trying to achieve, how you actually want your function to run as this technology gets implemented, both in the short term and the long term, and understanding kind of the different levers between cost, resiliency, experience, you know, control, other benefits, and actually having ways to measure that are more clear than just, you know, kind of somewhat ambiguous. We're going to take 20% or 30% of our costs out. And then the final part is just figuring out from a overall kind of automation program structure. If you look at this more as an automation strategy, not as an RPA strategy, and look at RPA as a accelerator or a catalyst, thinking about how you want your long-term effort to work. I think Tyler made a really good point around kind of using, if I interpreted it correctly, kind of using RPA almost as an ideation mechanism for kind of bigger ideas that that could result. And I think that's a really important aspect from the perspective of thinking through kind of a broader automation strategy as your toolkit becomes bigger, as the RPA firms build more features into their tools, as potential partnerships or consolidation happens in the software space. The kind of term automation is going to be a lot more expansive, where RPA is just a starter point. So starting to think through like, how's that going to work and what's our long-term approach to this? If you notice, most everything I said, like, we didn't really talk about RPA as a technology, right? We're kind of assuming, I think it's been proven the technology works. I think it provides a lot of the benefits that Phil talked about, but it's really kind of putting together all those structural pieces behind to enable success.
Yeah, I can add an extra piece to that, which is stop trying to view RPA as some kind of workaround to avoid engaging with IT. We've seen, I think, far too many projects fall apart because IT weren't engaged early on, and a lot of these applications are not viewed as enterprise grade until the IT guys understand it better and actually can look at it from a broader perspective, particularly when you're dealing with low code, on how this fits in with database schemas, other systems, and that sort of thing. So the more you can get IT on board with you as you go through this, I think the more success you will have longer term in getting adoption, getting scale, and getting better participation across areas and businesses. I've seen some real success where the CIO himself or herself have got involved and got very excited on board with this. And I think stop trying to work around technology, try and work with those people, because that will ultimately lead to better cooperation, better scale, better success, and better industrialization.
Okay. Tyler, is there anything that you see that should be essential for an organization looking to implement RPA today, or do you actually think there's a risk of a shift backwards, or the pendulum swinging in a different direction for some organizations, for them to, on occasion, go away from some automation for a small time period?
So no, I don't think this is going to go away. To the point, I think that this is an evolutionary technology. This is at a phase of evolution towards the potential of automation, higher value delivery. If the pendulum will swing on anything, I don't see it swinging so much on the tech as much as to the point I think that or to the point that Kevin had made around the governance models, the standards that exist, the establishment of practices, centers of excellence that need to probably be stood up within organizations, the learning that has to come from this. So where it will swing will be, standing up a lot of these, good centers, standing up, what do we want to leverage, right? As an organization, lean startup principles to kind of test, refine, implement your processes, create standards for an organization, ensure that there's training, support, ensure to the point that was made, change management being so important, I think, and what will change over time is going to be kind of how processes that support this sort of technology and automation are going to evolve. How do we lean down? How do we become more agile? How do we focus on developing and leveraging this sort of technology to build those minimum viable products or to test hypothesis? So I think that that's what becomes most important, and that's the sort of change that I see that would likely continue to take place. I think an important message that I like to think of when it comes to implementing any of this is to promote adoption, to promote challenges, and to understand the value of this sort of technology in any practice for the community that you're part of. Success begets success, right? And a big part of, I think, the process of change, process of change is the purpose, right? For to be very McLuhan-esque.
I think that's a great quote to end on. It's a great quote for us to end on. I actually want to thank our panelists for joining us today, and I want to thank the audience for attending. This concludes our panel discussion. We ask you to please come back at 1 p.m. To watch the next panel discussions, where experts will discuss how RPA is being used across industries. Thank you.